So now that you have your belt patterns, whether you're using my patterns or somebody else's, I'm going to show you really quickly how I prefer to transfer these patterns from paper onto leather so you can actually carve them, tool them, and make a belt with them. So once you get your patterns printed off on a piece of paper like this, you're just going to want to set that down. And then if you can get your hands on some tracing paper like I have here or something similar to this. Now I just have my transfer paper sitting on top of the belt patterns, and now I prefer to use an 8B pencil. So what that 8B means is that this graphite is really soft and will transfer super easy. And from here, we're just going to start tracing the belt patterns onto the transfer paper with our 8B pencil. And now once you get your patterns traced on the top side of this transfer paper, you also want to take it, remove this paper, flip this over, and then trace them on the back side as well. So we want the patterns to be on both sides of the transfer paper. An important thing to note if you are deciding to use my belt patterns, so if you purchase any of these belt pattern sheets from my website, shameless plug, these sheets are 3 separate belt patterns, so it's not one big pattern. These patterns are meant to be repeatable with themselves, so you can repeat this pattern for the full length of the belt, obviously. But this pattern isn't meant to work with this pattern isn't meant to work with this pattern. They're 3 separate patterns. And in this video, I'm going to be working with these particular patterns, which are listed as the number 4 floral belt patterns on my website. So if you do decide to purchase them, I'm actually going to go through in this video and I'll show you a little bit later on how to repeat them throughout the entire structure of a belt. I'm also going to be carving and tooling these belt patterns out individually, highlighting that process in depth, and hopefully that will help you out going forward. And now that we have our patterns traced out on both sides, the front and back of the transfer paper, you want to go through and carefully cut out each individual pattern and cut them out on these outer lines, obviously. However you want to go about doing that is fine, but once you do that, you will now have your 3 separate belt patterns all cut out, and now it's time to transfer them onto the leather. Now the leather I'm going to be using in today's video is some full grain natural vegetable tanned tooling leather, Herman oak to be specific. All 3 of these pieces are a 9-10 ounce thickness, which is what I personally use for the main body of my belts. One thing you may have noticed is this middle piece right here is actually a darker color compared to these 2 pieces. This is all the exact same leather, and this piece actually did look like these when I first got it in. However, it's been sitting in my shop for a little while and just been exposed to light, so it has naturally tanned or darkened up a little bit more. That's one thing to be aware of with this natural vegetable tanned leather is as it ages, it will darken and patina over time. It's a really neat process, but let's move on. So we have our pattern and we have our leather. Now this leather is bone dry, no moisture in it whatsoever. I've also got it backed and prepped for tooling. You can use whatever you want, but this is just some blue painter's tape that I have on the back side of the leather, and that is to limit any stretch that may occur to this leather throughout the carving and tooling process. And I'm going to go ahead and just start working with the first pattern on this number 4 sheet. And you don't necessarily have to use an 8B pencil during this step of the process. I'm just using a regular pencil now. You could also use a stylus, however you want to go about doing it. But we're going to take this dry leather, take our pattern, and carefully place it onto the leather, making sure that we get everything lined up edge to edge or border to border like it should be. And then we're just going to start tracing this onto the leather. So we're going to start drawing on the tracing paper that's sitting on top of the leather, and that should transfer all of the graphite on the back side of that onto the leather. If you have some sort of weight like this that you can place on the pattern while you are tracing it out, that will help keep everything in place and not moving. And if you're interested in how I made this, I'll actually drop a video in the description, a link in the description of a video of making a simple leather weight like that as well. But once we get everything lined up, now we're just going to start tracing. So now, this is what our leather looks like. And the main reason that I like transferring like this is because if you accidentally had your pattern on there sideways or crooked, or obviously none of these lines are perfect, you can actually go through at this point, and if you're like me and you want everything to be almost as perfect as you can get, you can actually go through with your 8B pencil and touch all of these lines up or fix anything as needed. So since the leather's still dry, we can go through with our pencil and draw on it no problem. So this is why I prefer to transfer the patterns like this, and it also allows you to use these patterns to your interpretation. So if there is a specific element that you don't like or something that you would like to alter, you can go through and erase and change it and mix it up however you like. So this is why I like to do it. I'm going to go through really quick and touch these lines up, and then we'll start carving on this thing. So before I start tooling on that piece of leather, I want to share with you how this pattern is designed to be repeated with itself. If you do decide to use this particular pattern, let's pretend we have a belt here. Once you trace this first section out onto the belt, there is no inverting necessary. You can keep the pattern just as it is, and these flowers, this flower and this flower on the end, are made to line up with one another. So you would just take this pattern, slide it down, line these flowers up, and then you're good to go to just continuously trace throughout the rest of the belt, and you can continue with your same flow and not break any of that up. I just realized that I actually did put this pattern onto the piece of leather upside down, which brings up another good point, is there really is technically no up top or bottom to this pattern, considering the way you repeat it is there's no inversion. You just slide it down and line it up like I just showed you. So this technically is upside down, but it really doesn't matter. But yeah, that's how you would repeat this pattern. Now let's get right to it on that one. This is going to be a long video because I am going to go through and share with you all of these details for each pattern and then tool each pattern out individually. So bear with me, but let's get right to it. So now we're moving on to the second pattern on this number 4 worksheet, which just consists of leaves and some vine work and some scrolls. And now the way that this pattern is meant to be repeated, as you can see, there's a little bit of scrolls and vine work flowing right here, and then just some random lines right here at the end. And so once you get your initial layout of this pattern, what you want to do is you would take this down here, and you may have to do some penciling in and use your imagination, but it's meant to be like this, where you would just match these lines up with these lines and then continue on with the flowing motion of that pattern. Before I miss this down, you will notice right here on the end, I made this pattern where a leaf was the ending structure at the tip of this belt, and then I just penciled in a little bitty vine right here to make it look like this little piece right here was flowing out. Just to end the pattern right here, you can use your imagination and do it however you want, but that is how I decided to end it. Now let's get going with it. Alright guys, so this is going to be the final pattern on this number 4 worksheet and the final pattern for this video. So once you have this bottom pattern right here transferred onto the leather like so, the way that you would go through and repeat this pattern is it is meant to actually be inverted. So you're going to take this pattern right here, flip it directly upside down, and just like we matched these flowers up earlier on this top pattern, we're going to do the same thing with this one. The only difference is this pattern is now flipped over. Go down here, line these flowers up, and when you get those flowers lined up, that is now how you can continue on with this pattern and it doesn't disrupt the flow. Another thing to keep in mind on this particular pattern is it does have a double border or an inset border, whatever you want to call it. And so if you take a look right here, this dotted line right here is your hypothetical stitch line. The next line up right here is your normal border, and then I have another smaller border right here. And it's just another way to mix these designs up and give it a different look. I'll show some videos or pictures at the end of this video of how I normally color these belts up when I make them with a pattern like this with a double border. I will sometimes dye this outside border and then leave this inside border natural color to match the tooling. So again, just another way to mix it up, mix your designs up and change how it looks. But let's go ahead and get this pattern tooled out. All right, guys, there you have it. Here are all 3 of these floral belt patterns from the number 4 worksheet tooled into leather. Now, I went ahead and tooled all of these patterns out a little bit differently, and that was just to give you guys some different ideas or different techniques that you could potentially implement in your work to mix it up and try some new things out. So I hope it was helpful. If it was, make sure to leave a like on the video and comment below which one of these patterns is your favorite. I'm having a hard time deciding. I don't know which one I like the most. And if you guys do decide to make some belts with these, I think they would make some really sweet belts. Don't forget to tag me in your social media posts. I'd love to see your work. If you want to see more videos like this on these belt pattern tool along videos, then click one of these videos up here. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Click this little button over here, and that's going to keep you up to date with all of these videos when I do post them. I really appreciate you guys for watching, but till next time, we'll see you.